Hello and good morning, students. Welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Students, today we have with us Dr. Bhim Singh Daya. He is a retired professor of English. He has also been the Vice Chancellor from Kurukshetra University. Today, our topic of discussion will be Wordsworth as a Critic, Part 2. Students, before we begin, I would like to tell you, if you have any queries, please call on the toll-free number 1800-110-430. I would also request you to please call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture. So before wasting much time, let us get the lecture started. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Well, we resume today our discussion of Wordsworth as critic, and he is known as critic by his essay called Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Lyrical Ballads, as I said yesterday, was the first volume of poems which he, along with S.T. Coleridge, wrote. Coleridge, of course, had only 4 poems. The rest of the ballads were by Wordsworth himself. That came out in 1798. But then it was suggested by his well-wishers that since it was new kind of poetry, new compared to the 18th century poetry, which used to be critical rather than lyrical, by Pope, Johnson and company. And therefore, people since have been used to that sort of poetry, it was necessary to introduce them to the new kind, and it will require some explanation why this new kind of poetry and what is it about, what is its significance, so on and so forth. So yesterday we did first half of the essay, Preface to the Lyrical Ballads, and in the first half primarily Wordsworth was discussing what is poetry. You know Wordsworth's style. He takes quite some time and quite a length of writing to explain things. Not that he doesn't know, but that is his style. Elaborate, inclusive, even complex, involved, and so on and so forth. So yesterday he explained what he meant by poetry, what he understands by poetry. Today, in the later part, he would be discussing what is a poet. So let us see what he has to say. What is a poet, he asks, and then answers, he is a man speaking to men. A man, it is true, endowed with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. A man pleased with his own passions and volitions, and who rejoices more than other men in the spirit of life that is in him, delighting to contemplate similar volitions and passions as manifested in the goings on of the universe, and habitually impelled to create them where he does not find them. Stop. Well, you can imagine the length of his sentence. This is one sentence, but he has said so many things in one sentence. Sentence is full of clauses, full of phrases. Every clause and every phrase brings new item, new aspect of what is a poet. So he tries to be comprehensive and keeps qualifying. He makes a statement which looks very simple, but then he starts qualifying it, adding 1-2 more dimensions to that definition. Let us see how it goes. What is a poet, he asks? To whom does he address himself? And what language is to be expected from him? He doesn't say what language he speaks. He says what language is expected from him. And then he answers, he is a man speaking to men. He is a man speaking to men. Why does he emphasize the man and speaking to men? He is doing it because earlier the tradition has been that poet is something special. Poet is a man of genius. Poet is a gifted person, gifted by God or muses and so on. That's why in earlier times poets used to invoke the muses, goddess of poetry, goddess of music, goddess of this, that, knowledge, education, so on and so forth. But Wordsworth says no, there is nothing special about the poet. He is like any other man, and he is one among other men. He speaks to those men. So his poetry is not written for any other purpose, not to please goddesses, nor to please himself, but to please the people. So the social dimension of poetry, romantic poetry, to which Wordsworth belongs, and in fact he was one of the pioneers, the main one, the major one, he defines. Blake comes before him, but then Blake did not write this kind of preface. He did not argue what kind of new poetry he was going to write. But Wordsworth does, and that's why he is considered the leader of the movement called Romantic poetry. So he is a man speaking to men. A man, it is true, now he starts qualifying. Simple man speaking to men, but then he is not like other men. Now he differentiates. He is endowed with more lively sensibility. He is endowed with, is gifted with more lively sensibility. What does that mean? Each one of us has sensibility. We sense things and we are sensible of what is happening around us. We can study life, we can read life, we can understand life. That is what sensibility is. But then he says the poet has that sensibility in greater measure than ordinary people. That is why he can feel it more intensely, more deeply, in greater detail, and that separates him from the common people. No doubt he is one among them, but at the same time he is one of those who is specially gifted with certain qualities of human nature, and that makes a big difference. So more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness. Second and third qualities. First sensibility, then enthusiasm, then tenderness. Enthusiasm because all of us see the sunrise, all of us see the clouds in the sky, all of us see flowers, so on and so forth, but we don't feel excited. We just go about doing our business, seldom attending to what is around us. But then for a poet, everything is a wonder. You remember Wordsworth wrote a poem on the cloud. He says, when I see a cloud in the sky, that is a poem. He gets excited, he gets elated, he gets spirited. So that is the difference between ordinary people and the poet. Ordinary people go about never minding whether there is sun, there is cloud, whatever. Let it be there, they are busy with their own work. But poet is not committed to work so much as to observation of what is around us. And what is around the poet? Nature first and then human nature. Larger nature and then nature which humans carry among them, each inside him or her. So, he has greater sensibility, more lively, more enthusiasm and tenderness also. Tenderness means he has love and sympathy for every object around him. He doesn't detest anything. He doesn't hate people or nature, nothing. That again is a special quality. Most of us carry all sorts of feelings. We don't like people just for their faces, the way somebody walks, the way somebody talks, the way people do this, that and that. So all sorts of reasons for our disliking. But a poet does not have such strong dislikings, unless of course it will come later. It's a moral question. Because he can't love a ruffian, can't love a criminal, so on and so forth. Who has further quality? First is sensibility, then is enthusiasm, then is tenderness, and the fourth is he has greater knowledge of human nature. Because most people remain ignorant about what human nature is, because they don't waste time on studying human nature, in knowing what people are like. But a poet does. He has that curiosity. He wants to understand how people live, what do they do, what do they think, and how do they treat each other. All these questions are relevant for the poet because he is interested. It is a subject. Most people are interested in making money, doing their jobs, doing their family duties, so on and so forth. So the poet is more of an idler. He is not that much interested in all these things, except the minimum subsistence. Of course, he has to go on, he has to live, he has to eat, he has to dress himself. These are elementary things which he needs, but beyond that, he has no hunger for money, property, position, status, so on and so forth, which common people will have. They will do anything. They will indulge even in wrong and immoral practices to attain what they want to attain. But a poet would not do that. Poet has a morality. Poet has tenderness. And poet also has knowledge of human nature. He knows human nature is various. It is varied. No two persons are alike. And yet he knows that he has to live among them and live peacefully, productively, creatively. That is his aim of life. And a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. He has a more comprehensive soul, which means all-compassing, comprehensive, because most of us have limited set of feelings, sentiments, ideas, opinions, but he has greater wealth of all these. He has more comprehensive vision of life, of universe, of mankind, how the world goes. That's why he can write. He is a sort of specialist on human nature and human life. All of us are not. Most of us are not. Those who are, they commit themselves to writing. They can't help it. After all, they have to give expression to their strong feelings and opinions. And he goes on. It's a very long sentence. That is how Wordsworth writes, clause after clause after clause, sentence. You keep waiting for its ending, but ending comes very late. And it goes on. Another clause. A man pleased with his own passions and volitions. Pleased with his own passions and volitions. He is not so much interested in what the next man is doing. He is more interested in how he feels, what he thinks. So he is his own student. He studies himself. Most of us don't. We don't try to know what we are made of. What are our feelings, our sentiments, our ideas, opinions. We never analyze that. We never go into the depth of what we are. But a poet would. And who rejoices more than other men in the spirit of life that is in him. He rejoices, means he enjoys the spirit in him, the soul, whatever it feels. That's why he has greater excitement, more comprehensive. Others are more committed to work, jobs, assignments, making money, building this or that, creating more property. These are worldly things in which common people are interested. But a poet is not interested in worldly things. He is interested in deeper things. Depth about his own self, depth about human nature as a whole, and depth about life. What is this business of life about? Why are we born? Where do we go? What is the purpose of this life on earth? All these things are a concern of the poet. He is deeply involved in all these. He spends all his time on these matters, not on worldly acquisitions. Delighting to contemplate similar volitions and passions as manifested in the goings on of the universe, delighting to contemplate similar volitions and passions as manifested in the goings on of the universe. What goes on in life, how life goes, how people live, what do they do, where do they come from, where do they go. So he is, in short, a philosopher. Though Wordsworth is not using the word, but in a roundabout manner, as is his style, he is pinpointing this quality of the poet. The poet is a born philosopher. He thinks deeply and he thinks widely. He thinks about himself, he thinks about others. He thinks about the universe and life as a whole, which most people don't do. So that is the difference between the poet and the common people. And habitually impelled to create them where he does not find them. He says passions and volitions. Wherever he finds them absent, he tries to create them. Means he wants a live world. He doesn't want a dead world. He doesn't want a negative world. He doesn't want a vicious world. His vision of world and life is a glorious one. He is a well-wisher of everybody. So that is the difference between the poet and the common man. To these qualities, Wordsworth goes on, to these qualities he has added a disposition to be affected more than other men by absent things as if they were present. Well, another difference between the poet and the common people. He says the common people go about their business, doing what they do, feeling what they feel, thinking what they think, and never caring to know what they do not know. There is a critic called F.R. Lewis. He has beautifully said that there are people in this universe who do not know what they do not know. It's a wonderful statement. People who do not know what they do not know. So that is the depth of ignorance. He says the poet is not that ignorant. So for the time being, take a break, we will come back. Thank you. Is it all right? Well, to resume our discussion of Wordsworth as critic, we take up another statement that he makes in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. This statement is, however exalted a notion we would wish to cherish of the character of a poet, it is obvious that while he describes and imitates passions, his employment is in some degree mechanical compared with the freedom and power of real and substantial action and suffering. Well, now Wordsworth is coming to the process of writing poetry. You remember he began with what is poetry, then he came to what is a poet, and now he is coming to third thing, how poetry is written. He says, I have said that poets are endowed with more sensitive nature, greater sensibility, more comprehensive knowledge, this and that. So many differences between the poet and the common man. Now he comes to how does he write? What does he write about? So here he says, however exalted a notion we would wish to cherish of the character of a poet, his employment is in some degree mechanical. He says the business of writing poetry is in some way mechanical, which is something new, because generally we say it is creative. The process of writing poetry is creative, or any kind of writing. Literary writing is a creative writing. But he says, compared to natural life, compared to how we feel, how we act, how we think, what the poet does is mechanical. To an extent, Wordsworth is right, because after all, what does a poet do? What does a dramatist do? Or any storyteller does? What they do is, they imagine people, different kinds of people. They imagine different kinds of situations. Then they imagine different responses to those situations by different people. So many things the poet has to imagine, which he is not actually going through, he is not living, he is only imagining. So Wordsworth has a point when he says that the whole process to an extent is mechanical, where you have to imagine. But then he will go on, he will qualify later as he always does. However exalted a notion we would wish to cherish of the character of a poet, it is obvious that while he describes and imitates passions, his employment is in some degree mechanical, compared with the freedom and power of real and substantial action and suffering. In a way, there is a difference, he is right. What people actually do and what the artist acts, it is just like theatre. You see, the actor imitates our actions, our thoughts, our emotions. So it is second hand activity. He is not the one who is going through those emotions or actions, he is only imitating. So he has a point. there is some aspect in it which is mechanical. You know Shakespeare's plays, how many actors involved, how many characters created, how many situations created, and in each situation more than one character involved and each behaving differently. So, the poet or the writer has to imagine all this and then recreate. So, this activity of recreation Wordsworth calls mechanical. So that it will be the wish of the poet to bring his feelings near to those of the persons whose feelings he describes, nay, for short spaces of time perhaps, to let himself slip into an entire delusion and even confound and identify his own feelings with theirs, modifying only the language which is thus suggested to him by a consideration that he describes for a particular purpose, that of giving pleasure. He says it's a difficult job, but a mechanical one, and the poet has to do it. He is describing a character, he is describing a situation. It may be drama, it may be a fable or whatever, but poetry, literature is about people, their actions, their emotions, feelings, thoughts and so on. So, he says when the poet does all this, he has to imagine all sorts of people. He chooses to describe all sorts of situations. So, it can't be denied that it is a second hand activity. You are not actually living those situations, living those emotions. You are only acting. In a way, Wordsworth is comparing the poet to an actor. Just as the actor imagines himself to be Hamlet or King Lear or Falstaff or this or that character, obviously he has to first imagine the personality and then act accordingly. He has been given the text, but then text is words. Words embody in them the character as well as the situation. So, the actor in his speech has to bring live both the character and the situation. He has to do through language, and language has to be so powerful, has to be so speaking, that it recreates the real people and real situations. But then there is another element Wordsworth talks about. All right, he does it faithfully, but then he describes for a particular purpose, that of giving pleasure. He says it is not just recreating a character and a situation. He has an added responsibility, and that responsibility is of giving pleasure to the audience, to the reader. It may be theatre, it may be just your private room. The fact that you are reading literature or watching it performed, you are doing it for pleasure. Why do you go to cinema? Why do you go to theatre? Why do you read poetry or novel? You do it for pleasure. You want to enjoy it. So, the writer has to keep that in mind also, that it is not merely describing things or recreating people. The added responsibility is that you have to do it in a manner that it provides pleasure to the reader or to the viewer in the theatre. Here then, he will apply the principle of selection, which has been already insisted upon. He will depend upon this for removing what would otherwise be painful or disgusting in the passion. He will feel that there is no necessity to trick out or to elevate nature, and the more industriously he applies the principle, the deeper will be his faith that no words which his fancy or imagination can suggest will be to be compared with those which are the emanations of reality and truth. Wordsworth is insisting upon narrowing the gap between the reality and its performance. The poet is a performer, just like the actor. But his success as a performer, as a poet, lies in how well does he perform. How well does he succeed in reducing the gap between the reality and the production? The minimum, the gap between the two, the best presentation will it be? More powerful the poetry will be. And I think Wordsworth is right. We know even the actors, there are all sorts of actors, but some stand out, others do not, because they have greater talent. Talent for reducing that gap between the reality and the presentation. Wordsworth is right there. And he says it is not just the actor, the poet has to do the same thing, because after all he is a presenter, he is presenting the reality about people and actions, their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions, what they do, what they perform. So all that is being presented by the poet. And the best presentation will be one where there is the minimum gap between what is being presented and what was actually there in reality. He goes on and comes to, stumbles on Aristotle. He says, Aristotle, I have been told, has said that poetry is the most philosophic of all writing. Look at the way he says it. He says, Aristotle, I have been told, which means he has not read himself. And why has he not read? Because by conviction he was opposed to the classical ethos, classical aesthetics, classical concepts of what is poetry and what is its function. And Aristotle was the authority of the classical thought, classical school of aesthetics. Therefore, Wordsworth would not read it. Well, I wouldn't say it is his strength, it is his weakness. If you want to speak against somebody, you must first know what that somebody is. Without knowing what Aristotle has said, you are going ahead criticizing him. I don't know. I would not buy it or approve of it anyway, but that's what Wordsworth did. Aristotle, I have been told, has said that poetry is the most philosophic of all writing. It is so. Its object is truth, not individual and local but general and operative, not standing upon external testimony, but carried alive into the heart of passion. Truth, which is its own testimony, which gives competence and confidence to the tribunal to which it appeals, and receives them from the same tribunal. Poetry is the image of man and nature. Well, he gives a twist to what Aristotle has said, although he seems to be approving it, that poetry is most philosophic. But then he has his own definition of philosophy. Philosophy for Wordsworth does not mean to have read books from Plato onward. Aristotle, Cicero, Sidney, Pope, Dryden, all others, Longinus. If you have read all these, you would know what critical philosophy is. But Wordsworth says, no, to me, that is not real philosophy. Real philosophy emanates from life, and therefore you must know life intimately and must know it in depth. And what is life? Human nature. So time and again his emphasis comes back to human nature, which the poet must know to be a good poet. So poetry is the image of man and nature. So defines poetry again. The obstacles which stand in the way of the fidelity of the biographer and historian and of their consequent utility are incalculably greater than those which are to be encountered by the poet who comprehends the dignity of his art. He compares the poet to a biographer and historian. He says the writer of history and writer of biography also do similar jobs. But then there is a difference. The difference is that they are tied down to the facts available to them. Biographer, for example, will go into the study of when was somebody born, where was he born, to what kind of family was he born, and then how did he grow up, what did he do, schooling, education, this, that, and so on. A poet doesn't do that. Historian would do, biographer would do, but a poet imagines. He studies human nature and creates, because he is not writing about an individual. He is writing about man with capital M, life with capital L. So not individuals as such. Biographer and historian writes about individuals. But poet writes about man, the universal man, the man which is common to all, the sentiments, passions, emotions, sentiments which are common to all people. So universality is the distinction of the poet. The universality which is not there in biography or history. Well, to move further, it's a long essay. Well, he goes on to say further about the poet. He says, the poet is chiefly distinguished from other men by a greater promptness to think and feel without immediate external excitement, and a greater power in expressing such thoughts and feelings as are produced in him in that manner. So he is talking of two things. First, the creative quality of the poet, that he can imagine how other people feel and think and recreate them. Second quality, that he is gifted with language. He has command of the language by which he can describe, define, recreate any character, any situation, any feeling, and so on. So he is distinguishing the poet from the common man. Imagine when he started the essay, he had made a statement saying that a poet is a man speaking to men. I mean, not very different, like any other man speaking to men. But as he goes along in this long essay, keeps qualifying, and finally, when you reach the end of the discussion, you find that a poet is very different from other men. Just the reverse of what he had said in the beginning. Because if you add up all those qualifications, all those distinctions which the poet has, obviously he emerges very different from the common people. And the language also. The poet's language is superior to the language of the common people. Common people have limited stock of words at their command. At the same time, they have limited capability to make different uses of them. The poet alone is gifted with both these things, language as well as its usage. So that's why you find him different from common people. But as I said, Wordsworth started by saying that he is not different. He is a man speaking to men. But as you go along, he keeps bringing out distinctions, and finally the poet emerges a very different person from the common people. The distinction of meter is regular and uniform. Poetic diction, arbitrary and subject to infinite caprices upon which no calculation whatever can be made. So many distinctions. First is the distinction of meter is regular and uniform. Common people do not speak in poetry. They speak common language, common syntax, prose. But poet uses alliteration, poet uses rhythm, poet uses rhyme scheme, stanza form, and then form of the poem in general. So many devices, poetic devices you may call them, he uses to compose his poem, his poetry. So obviously he is not a common man. But Wordsworth in his own way, just to make you feel at home, started by saying that he is like us, not very different. So we get involved, we get curious, and then gradually he bombards us with so many distinctions, so many differences. And by the time we reach the end of the essay, we find that so much has come out which is different in the poet from the common man. And further, poetic diction, he says, not merely the meter. It is not just the meter which makes a difference between the common man's speech and the poetic speech, but the language itself is different. What we now call poetic diction. Wordsworth was against the 18th century poetic diction because that was artificial.
Excuse me, sir. I would like to interfere for a moment. We have a caller from Varanasi who has a question for you.
Sure.
Yes, sir.
Good morning, sir.
I'll be
Good
glad
morning,
to
ma'am.
answer.
Good morning. Yes, please
Hello.
Please go on. Please ask your doubt.
Yes, ma'am. I want to know the beauty of writing of William Wordsworth.
hearing.
And my second question is, how relevant the William Wordsworth in this world?
Sir, the caller has two questions. One of them is, what is the relevance of William Wordsworth in this world? And could you please repeat your second question? Sir, it would be very grateful of you to answer one of the questions put up by the caller. What is the relevance of William Wordsworth in this world?
Well, in this world you mean the present world, which is dominated by business. And Wordsworth, in a way, will be labeled as anti-business because he is giving a call for nature, return to nature, and living a natural life. But mind you, if you get farther and farther away from nature, you do lose something. You may not realize it, but more sensitive people do realize. You will also realize that mere business cannot make your life. In life, so many things are important. That's why your private life, your public life, your human relations, your family relations, your equation with your son, with your wife, daughter, so on and so forth, with your neighbor, with society as a whole. And Wordsworth is talking about these relations, human relations, and man's relation with the universe as a whole. Can you live without them? They are the most vital. Today's world is not without those values. World will never be so long as humanity is alive. All this will be relevant. All that Wordsworth is saying is most vital to life in any times. It may be our times or any other times, unless we are out to extinct ourselves. By the way, Mary Shelley, wife of P.B. Shelley, in the early 19th century, 1822, had written two books. One was Frankenstein, the other was The Last Man. She imagined that man will create, like himself, a Frankenstein robot, and that creation will destroy the creator himself. Let us hope we don't reach that. She had given the date 2381 or something. So you and I are safe. Maybe that stage reaches. And what we are left with, The Last Man, the second book, I'll advise you to read both those books. You'll get the answer. What is the next question?
Sir, this was one of the questions. So you can continue with the lecture.
Yeah, there is still time. Well, another statement that he makes is, having thus explained a few of my reasons for writing in verse and why I have chosen subjects from common life and endeavor to bring my language near to the real language of men, so on and so forth. Well, that is the crux of the matter in his essay. And you cannot appreciate Wordsworth without having in mind at the same time his predecessors, particularly Pope. Because before him comes Pope, the chief poet of the new classical age. And new classical age was far removed from nature, from reality. They created their own world. So Wordsworth is bringing us back that don't create a fictitious world of your own. Come back to the real world, which is natural, which is universal, and address that. Create poetry about this life, this world, these people. Then poetry has a meaning, it has a relevance. So Wordsworth has great relevance. I am addressing the question again. If you understand all this, what is life and what life is about, Wordsworth is talking about that. And these questions are never irrelevant. It may be our age or maybe age coming further 100 years later. These questions, so long as humanity survives, will remain relevant forever. So do read Wordsworth. Don't run away from the relevance of this great poet. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Students, we will be having more such valuable sessions in the upcoming days. Till then, thank you and goodbye.